And we're back to learning JavaScript. Let me give you a quick intro to functions. In simple terms, functions that execute a certain code that we predefine, and we can then call this function. It's very helpful, especially when we have something that has to be repeated over and over again. Typical structure is to use the keyword function, then give your function a name, use parentheses, regular ones, and inside you have parameters. And then you use curly brackets, and inside of the curly brackets, you add the code that should be executed when we call our function. So this is always the main structure. And don't worry if this is a little bit confusing for now. If you've heard it first, might be. I'm going to give you an example now. First up, we'll define two variables. I use let a and b and give this numerical values, let's say 5 and 7. And we now want to have a function that calculates a times b. So this is the code to be executed inside of our curly brackets. And therefore our parameters need to be a and b in our case. So parameter 1 will be 5, parameter b 7. Let's set up the function. We use the keyword function. Now we'll just invent a name. Let me call that my function. It's always a good idea to use descriptive terms, so use a name that actually gives away what the function does. But in our case, I'll stick to my function. Inside p1 and p2 for parameter 1, parameter 2. Now we'll add our curly brackets. And inside, as I've said, we'll have to use a times b. And we want to use the keyword return. So when we call this function, it returns what is p1 times p2. We don't use directly a and b as parameters, but these placeholders, p1 and p2, because we may want to call this function with different values. So you actually define these, what is called a parameter. And then when you call this function using a and b, this is then called an argument. When you've done it often enough, you understand all of these terms a little bit better. Let us actually call this function. I use my function, and inside I now have to use a and b. So a and b are passed on to the function as parameters then, and this is how it's done. To display it, let me directly store our return, so the result of my function, in a variable. I'll call it result, and now I use document.write using result. And if I've done everything correctly, there you go, we have 5 times 7, therefore 35 is printed out here on our website. And if I would now, for example, change any of these numbers, you can see how 15 and 7 is now passed on to p1 and p2, and therefore the return is 15 times 7, which is 105. You can always change your function, for example, make it a sum. As I've changed the name, I also must change the name when I call this function. So instead of let result equals my function ab, I need to change it to let result equals sum ab. And there you go, we now can see 22, which is 15 plus 7. So as I've said, this is the function setup using the keyword function, the name, the parameters. Inside we have the code that is executed when we call the function. And here we call the function and basically assign the result of it to the variable results. And in this code line we print out the result. This is why we can see 22 on our website. Try to recreate that. We will encounter functions quite a lot in future tutorials. And then if you've used it over and over, it becomes pretty clear how that works, but I hope this example was already helpful. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.